Hi, I'm Alan, and welcome to this edition of Alan's Biking Adventures. Some of you had suggested I try something a little bit different. Up until now, all my videos have been time-lapse videos, so to speak, of my rides, my training rides. But some of you had suggested that I try maybe doing a voiceover and show some real-time footage. So I'm going to try things a little bit differently today. I hope you like it. Here we are starting off today's ride. Today's ride's going to be a 10-mile training ride, and it's going to be a trip to the park, specifically Warrenuncle Park in Roselle, New Jersey. I used to ride to this park a lot in the time since the pandemic started, when I got back into cycling. In part because it was a very easy trip. I didn't have to worry about navigating. There was no risk of getting lost somewhere. Also, by doing laps around the park, I was never too far from home, so if something went wrong, I could always walk the bike home. And it was also easy for estimating distances, namely because it's about 4 miles to get to the park. It's about a 2-mile lap around the park, and so for a 10-mile route, that would be a trip to the park, 1 lap around, and a trip home, which we're doing today. For longer distances, I would just add more laps. It was easy enough to calculate a trip regarding any even number of miles in excess of 10 miles. Of course, it gets boring after a while, and so for my longer rides, I did have a route that I would follow, sort of an out and back route, but I digress. You may be interested in learning how I got into cycling as an adult. I'm going to speed up the video here so that this isn't an extremely long video. Anyway, you may be wondering how I got into cycling as an adult. I started out, this goes back to when I was in Weight Watchers. I was about 240, 250 pounds when I first joined. And of course they encourage exercise as part of their program. And so I got into walking, and walking evolved into jogging. Jogging evolved into this big goal of training for a marathon. Unfortunately, I didn't get very far, because within a couple of weeks of taking up jogging, I developed really debilitating pain in my left ankle to the point where I couldn't even walk. And so I went to an orthopedist who diagnosed me with tendinitis in the left ankle and suggested that the problem was I was too heavy to be running. And he felt that I should probably wait until I was below 200 pounds before I tried taking up jogging. He said it was just too much pounding on the ankle. He prescribed some physical therapy and a boot cast. And after a while, the pain in the ankle subsided, and I was able to walk again without the boot cast. I waited until I got below 200 pounds. Actually, I waited until I got to about 180. Then I started jogging more. And lo and behold, the pain immediately started coming back in my left ankle. So that week, when I went to my Weight Watchers group, I lamented to my Weight Watchers leader that I wanted to take up jogging and run a marathon, and it didn't look like it was ever going to happen, because now it's even impacting my ability to go on long walks. She suggested to me, "Do you have a bicycle?" I said, "Yes, I do," because at the time I had a cheap bike that I had bought at Walmart. It was collecting dust. So she suggested I dust off the bike and try it out and see how I like bicycling. So I did. And I found I liked bicycling quite a bit. And I started riding laps around the neighborhood I lived in and riding quite hard. And I found that I could go for about a half an hour, not much longer. Shortly after that, I bought a heart rate monitor and discovered that the reason I could only go for about a half an hour is because I was riding way too hard. So I scaled back the intensity quite a bit to keep my heart rate within a particular range. And I found that all of a sudden I could go much further and much longer. I started doing bicycle tours, and this led to eventually buying my first road bike. And from there, it just took off from there. Instead of training for a marathon, I trained for century rides. I've done 4 or 5 centuries at this point in my life. And then at some point, I moved to an area that wasn't as cycling friendly. I got out of cycling, but I held on to that road bike. And with the onset of the pandemic, I got back into cycling. You may be wondering how I picked the distances for my routes. And I actually picked the distances. By the way, we're in the park now. I just realized that. I slowed the video back down to real time for the trip around the park. Thought it might be interesting. Anyway, I had bought a book when I wanted to train for my first century called Bicycling Magazine, The Complete Book of Long Distance Cycling. Shout out to Edmund Burke and Ed Pavelka. I think it's a great book they wrote. It's a little dated now, as it was written back in 2000, it looks like. So some of it has stood the test of time, and some of it is a bit dated. Anything technology related is a bit dated, but the training charts are very relevant. So I used their training program to train for my first century. And when I got back into cycling, I wanted to, initially I wanted to train for the 5-borough bike tour in New York City, which is a 40-mile tour. So I worked my way up to 40 miles for my long ride. And week 1 of the century program to ride a stronger century has 40 miles as its long ride. So I adapted that training week to be my base week, and that's basically what I ride, except for when I'm training for something longer. I did do a century this past year. I rode in a tour called iPedal NYC. I did the 100-mile route, and that was actually what inspired me to buy the Garmin Edge 530. When I rode that tour, I found that the route was not as well marked as it should have been or could have been, and I got lost a couple of times. The cue sheet wasn't that great either, and with the need to navigate, I was unable to go as fast as I would have liked, and so I ended up completing that century in a little over 8 hours. I would have liked to have gone faster than that. So I have bought a Garmin Edge 530, as I mentioned, which I love. I've planned out a number of routes, and so now the only route that's left going to the park is my 10-mile training route. All of my other rides are rides that I've mapped out in Garmin Connect, which is software that you download that goes with the Garmin Edge 530. Anyway, here we are in the park, riding along. So anyway, today's ride is a 10-mile easy ride. The book has a number of different rides based on the day of the week It calls for different paces on different days, and the 10-mile ride is actually something of a recovery ride. It is basically the way that I train is I do my long ride of 40 miles at the pace that I want to do the event I'm training for at. The next day I do 16 miles at the pace that I'm training at. And then the day after that happens to be today, which is 10 easy miles. Tomorrow I'll do 12 miles at pace, actually 13 miles, because that's what my 12-mile training route worked out to be in Garmin Connect. And then on Friday, I'll be doing 14 miles at a faster pace. After that, Saturday I take off. Sunday, I do 12 miles at my training pace. And Monday is back to my 40-mile training ride. My first road bike was a Scott Speedster S60, I believe it was, which served me well for about a dozen or so years before I handed it down to my son. And I purchased a Specialized Roubaix Sport. I purchased that back in, I want to say, March of last year, 2021, and I absolutely love that bike. I've ridden the hell out of it since I got it. I've already had to replace the chain and the cassette, namely because the chain wore out, but the shop that I go to didn't have any chains and had chains back ordered, and by the time the chain came in I had worn out the cassette as well. So I would recommend you don't delay replacing your chain when it wears out. I probably ride about 6,000 miles a year, and so I probably should go through a couple of chains a year at that pace. Anyway, I'm out of the park now and riding home, and so things are sped up again, because I think the park was the more interesting part of the ride. I like that park because in warmer weather you see a lot of joggers, you see a lot of cyclists. It's just a great place to ride. But it is 4 miles away from home, and I do have to ride to and from there. So this is my route home. You may be wondering what I do for nutrition on my longer rides. There's a lot of opinions out there as to how to fuel your rides. What I've been doing, what works for me, you do what works for you, but what works for me is I use gels. I eat gel about every 10 miles on any ride that is 20 miles or longer. So on my 40-mile rides, I'll bring with me 3 gels. Actually, if you watch the 40-mile training ride video that I already posted, even though it's sped up, you can see where I stopped for my gels. I also like to use a camelback to carry water. I actually have 2 camelbacks. One is a smaller capacity, which I use for my shorter rides, and one is a larger capacity that I use for my longer rides. Anything 20 miles or over, I use the larger camelback. It's easier for me to drink from a camelback than it is to use a water bottle. It also lets me carry much more water than I could with just 2 water bottles on the bike. Besides which, one of the mounting points for my bottle cage is taken up on my bike by a pump, air pump that I carry with me. Whenever I go out, I always carry with me a multi-tool, some tire levers, 2 spare inner tubes. I don't run tubeless, I do use inner tubes, and the pump. Anyway, here we are going through Cranford, so we are almost home. Just a little bit further in the ride, probably about a half a mile left in the ride. One of the downsides to the route that I take to get to the park is traffic lights and stop signs, and even stopping for the traffic lights and stop signs. Well, mostly anyway. Traffic lights I stop for. Stop signs I slow way down and check to make sure it's clear. And if it is clear, I roll through. But as you can see, I do stop for the red lights. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll leave my driveway in just a second. Okay, so that's it for today's ride. I hope you enjoyed what you saw. If you liked what you saw and stayed on this long, then please go ahead and like and leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Until next time, stay safe out there.